Many thanks, Lauren, and a very warm welcome to all of you who've joined us today. This is the launch event for our thematic inspection report on the preparations which the Probation Service has been making for the transition to a unified structure. And that's a transition which is only 6 weeks away now, and it'll be the 4th major reorganisation for the Probation Service in 20 years. It will involve, as you'll hear soon, thousands of staff and thousands of cases moving into the new structure. So it's very important to get that transition process right. Staff we spoke to across the country, I think, were certainly more positive about this reform than they were about the TR reform 6 years ago. Most welcome the move to a unified service, and I certainly welcome it too. But most of all, I think what they will welcome is a period of stability after the end of June. Shortly, you'll be hearing from Tessa, Webb and Wendy Martin, who led this inspection, and they'll talk you through some of the key findings from our review. Next slide, please, Lauren. I'm sure most of you will already know this, but for those of you perhaps who are not so close to the detail, the new probation delivery model involves 12 unified regions across England and Wales, and within each of those regions there will be local probation delivery units, 108 of those. The number of those PDUs will vary across the country. So, for example, there'll be 18 in London, 6 in Wales, 9 in Greater Manchester, and 9 in the West Midlands. Each of the 12 regions will be headed by a regional probation director, and they were appointed in April of last year, and they will have a senior team which includes a head of operations, a head of interventions, a head of corporate services, and so forth. And those regional senior leadership teams have gradually been put in place over the past years and are more or less complete now. The regional directors come from a mixture of CRC and NPS backgrounds, and I think that's a positive thing, and as do other members of those senior teams. You'll be hearing a bit more about the operating model later on in this talk from Tessa. Next slide, please, Lauren. So in terms of our methodology, as we do with all of our studies, we visited a range of local areas, in this case 5 different local areas, and you can see them on the map, and we did that over the period October to February of this year. It's a very rapidly moving picture that we saw, as you'd expect, as people gear up for the transition, and a real sense of momentum building after Christmas and after the new year, which we were able to pick up on in our inspection. Plenty has also been happening since February when we finished our fieldwork, and I'm pleased that we'll be joined for the Q&A session by Jim Barton, who's headed up the probation reform programme, who I'm hoping will be able to deal with questions relating to what's happened since the end of our inspection and what the current state of play is on transition. We interviewed people at every level of the probation service, from frontline probation officers and PSOs and staff working in unpaid work teams to all 12 regional directors, and we also interviewed key players at a national level, including Amy Rees and key staff within the probation reform programme itself. Importantly, we talked to both CRC and NPS staff to get their different perspectives on the transition, and we were also able to talk to trade union representatives as well. It was important to visit Wales because Wales has had some important lessons, having gone earlier with the unification of offender management functions from December of 2019. It was useful to get to the insights of colleagues in Wales as well. And my thanks to everyone who's helped with what was an extensive set of fieldwork, an extensive set of interviews for this thematic, and thanks for all of your help. So that's how we did it. I'm now going to pass over to Tessa, who's going to talk us through some of the things that we found.
Good morning. Just to sort of give you an outline, so Wendy and I we're working to our Domain 1 standards of leadership, staffing, services, information and facilities. So Wendy and I are going to alternate as we go through on the different standards. Starting with leadership, It was we did conclude it's a well-led program, and it was against the backcloth of the challenges of the pandemic. And I think what really we had huge respect really for the managers that we were speaking, whether it was at national level or at the MPS or the CRCs, in particular at the MPS and CRCs, those senior managers who are leading this change program were also mostly doing this against a backcloth of uncertainty about their own roles and responsibilities as how they move into a new structure as well. I just think that needs to be acknowledged. So not only were they trying to support staff to make sure they kept services delivered on the ground during the pandemic, and through a lot of this thematic while we were doing the field work, we went into the third lockdown, so it was very testing times. But people were facing a lot of uncertainty as well, and we were very mindful of that during the field work. There are multiple interdependencies across the work streams. This is really complicated. We've got 54 organisations all landing into one new organisation on the 26th of June. That means that the data from different companies of the private sector and the voluntary sector and the MPS do not all necessarily match. So that's been challenging, and that will come through in some of the other bits that we've covered during this presentation. There was a good structure with a national team across all the key work streams, and then each region had its own transition board and were completing a coordinated workbook. So it was important that communication was going up and down nationally into the regions, but equally at a regional level, it was important that the senior leaders, whether they were in the MPS or the CRC, are communicating effectively. And where we found there was joint participation at those senior management boards from the CRCs and the MPS, that was where we found it working most effectively. And it's just worth acknowledging, Justin touched on it, the direction of the travel. We just found in most situations, the workforce, wherever we spoke to people, were very supportive of the direction of travel to a unified service, which was very different from transforming rehabilitation. It was tougher for the staff that have been working in interventions, particularly in the CRCs, unpaid work and through the gate, because the announcement of how they fitted into this new national structure didn't come until June of last year, and was shaped by some of the changes influenced by the pandemic. Next slide, please. Thank you. So underpinning the new structure of the new organisation is the target operating model. Initial draft was, I think, quite substantially changed actually before the published version that came out in 2021. And that provides not just a position for day one, but actually it's a long-term vision for where the probation services want to get to. And it's a new probation service, and the target operating model in the published version was considerably more inclusive and didn't feel quite so much like the National Probation Service doing a takeover, I suppose, which was one of the bits we picked up at the start of this thematic. It's important that everyone appreciates that not everything in that target operating model is going to happen on day one. It is a staged approach until 2024. I've been using the analogy for quite some time that really the 26th of June of this year is house move day, and there's a lot of work to follow that then follows from that process. It's going to take time. The good news is the change programme is supported by additional funding of 155 million, and that's for the first year, and it is implicit, and some of the changes that are being implemented is that additional funding continues into the future, because that will affect the plans to recruit and train more probation officers, improve the ICT, improve the estate, and in particular from an inspector's point of view, that will lead to, we hope, to more manageable caseloads for practitioners, which is something that's come out in our other inspection reports. Next slide, please, Lauren. This is a very brief overview of the target operating model in the new structures. Your probation practitioner, which could be a probation officer or probation services officer, will have a range of different services that they can call upon to work with service users. They can individually use toolkits that they will be trained in and supported with to work on a one-to-one level with individuals. They'll also be encouraging them to access the universal services in our communities, particularly under mental health and drug and alcohol services. The preferred, the Rolls-Royce interventions delivered by the probation service will be the accredited programs. Particularly, they target sexual offending, domestic abuse and thinking skills. And there's also a range of structured interventions that can be delivered for such as anger management for perhaps less serious cases. The bit that is really interesting, and I think personally very exciting, and I'll cover this a bit more when we get to services, is the commissioned rehabilitative services and the regional outcome innovation funds. I won't go into a lot of detail now because I think we'll pick it up shortly and in more detail, but that does give the senior leaders in the regions an opportunity to actually develop the range of services more bespoke to their local communities. Next slide, please, Lauren. So this just gives you an overview of the timescale. You heard me mention, this is a house moving 26th of June. And for those of you, if you can think back to when you've moved house, it can feel pretty chaotic. And I would suspect that is probably, there's some nervousness and trepidation amongst probation staff at the moment as they head towards the 26th of June, as well as some excitement. But on day one, it's likely to feel messy and a bit chaotic, as the approach is a lift and shift approach, so that service users do not have a change in who's supervising them on that day, and they're reporting to the same building, and people have got the same caseloads when they come in, but they will be picking up, certainly from the CRC side, new ICT systems, new databases, and so forth. So the programme has given themselves a period of time then to then move into service stabilisation and harmonisation. If I go back to my house moving, that's when you sort out what you've got, trying to make sure you've got the right role in the right place, seeing where everybody sits. That's complicated because you've got different operating models coming from the parent organisations, from the CRCs, and people are moving across from different databases. It's important that staff have completed all the mandatory training. They've been doing different pieces of work under the existing structure. CRC staff have not been managing high risk of harm cases. The MPS staff have not been managing some of the more chaotic, medium, lower risk harms of cases. There's new skills to be acquired as they're going to, in the long-term vision of the new model is they will move to a blended caseload. So people won't have a concentration of so much of one type of cohort to another. So March 2022 and to 2024 is what is called service transformation. And that's really, and certainly as the inspectorate, we're becoming along to see, has the target operating model really started to come alive? Professionalisation is very important. There will be an increase in the number of trained and qualified probation officers and a registration process that will support that. And there are planned improvements to the case management system and risk assessment tools, probation buildings and so forth. So if I go back to my analogy, that's when you get your new fitted kitchen and your swanky new bathroom coming in on all of those things. So it's going to take time, but there's a lot of passion and there's a lot of excitement behind it. I'm going to hand over to Wendy.
Thank you, Tessa. This slide is quite busy and I apologise for that, but it's useful to see, I think, as a starting point when we're talking about staffing, what the new regions are going to look like as they deliver that target operating model, as they settle down. And as I think Justin says, that kind of the heads of are in place in the majority of regions. And as staff move over on day one, it'll be sorting out, using Tessa's analogy, putting out where the chairs are going and who's sitting in which piece of the organisation. Can you have the next slide, please? So it's not a small task. 8,500 people are moving on day one, and that is actually a total of 7,500 full-time equivalent. And I think this is the most challenging area for the service to deliver. It's complex, and the scale of the task is enormous, really. I was struck, and I always am struck by this now, 54 different organisations are moving on day one, and that includes those that are currently directly employed by CRCs, parent organisations, and also people in the current supply chain, and they're either moving to the unified probation service or to a supplier within the dynamic model. And as it says there, about half of the staff have joined CRC since transforming rehabilitation. So half those staff have no experience of working for a government-run probation service. So there's time to, it will take time to settle. The role assignment process has not been without issue, and there's been delay for some grades in particular. And again, this was picked up earlier a little bit. We found for the ACO grade of staff, originally that was planned for September last year, and I think really it's only in the last few weeks, well, end of April throughout, that's sort of settled. So that's caused kind of a lot of anxiety for people who are driving the change programme locally and trying to support their staff when they don't know where their future is. And I think also similarly, those staff in corporate roles, I think there's still some uncertainty for some of those, how they're going to fit into the new model and whether they map across or not. We also found that despite assurances from technology colleagues, staff have anxieties about how feasible it is that everybody will get onto the SOP HR system, which deals with pay and expenses. There's lots of contingencies in place to ensure that staff are paid, but obviously that's a real priority to get right from day one. Our recommendation in staffing was around an inclusive culture, and it's fair to say the culture of any new organisation will take time to develop. And as Justin hinted to earlier, the language was really important, and throughout our inspection we found a real shift in the language and how people were talking about transition. It wasn't going back, it moved away from things like going back to trust days or takeover. And I think the announcement this week of the probation service is really welcome, because that sets the tone for what is a new organisation for everybody. The issue with the recruitment of sufficient numbers of staff, particularly I think in the southern regions, it remains, and we've commented on this previously. Transition kind of is part of it, but it's nothing new that we've seen. We know that there is difficulty with recruitment, and in some areas we saw vacancy rates of 35% for probation officers. We know that HMPPS have published a new probation workforce strategy, and that came out last year, and that made a real commitment to recruit new staff, and it also commits to a more diverse workforce as well, which we were pleased to see, including better pathways for those who've been in the criminal justice system themselves, or those who want to move from being a PSO to a PO. In each of the regions that we went to, we saw many new PQIPs, which is great because that's the flow. And I think, I can't remember who said it, but I like the term that's used about growing our own to kind of plug the gaps. But then the issue with that is obviously in some offices their numbers exceed the amount of qualified probation staff. So there needs to be a balance struck between how many PQIPs are recruited to increase that headcount and the ability of the organisation to be able to sustain it and support those people appropriately so they are retained going forward. We Also made a recommendation about the skill base of CRC staff, particularly around commissioning corporate staff. And as I said earlier, these are particularly anxious staff group in terms of what their future roles would look like. And Tessa will talk later about the dynamic framework and how that commissioning will work. And it's really important that those skills are understood, because we felt that the majority of commissioning skills and quite a lot of corporate roles were sitting currently within CRC. They need to be really understood about what that skill base is as they move over to the unified probation service. Move on to diversity. Throughout the life of the CRC contracts, I think the Inspectorate have found it really difficult to obtain verified information about staff numbers and diversity data. It seems to be an ongoing problem, and the complete picture of the diversity of the staff in the new service will take time to get sorted. Managers have told us that the transfer of CRC staff data onto the civil service HR SOP system was a challenge. There's some GDPR issues and other complexities around that, but I know that a task is in place really for day one that people record their diversity data, which is obviously welcomed. Managers who are involved in the rollout of new technology say that they're confident that the assisted technology needs of staff have been considered, which was good to see. However, without the full analysis of that staff group, it is difficult to say whether all the needs will be catered for on day one. So that may take time. Obviously, it will be on an individual basis about individual need. One thing you'll know that we recently published our diversity thematic inspection, but we looked at some positives. Actually, we found that there was a lot of discussion as a result of the death of George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter movement, and that provoked some useful discussions about issues of race. And what we saw in some regions was actually this was a really good way of bringing CRC and NPS staff together already to talk about those things, and also that some regions were able to provide access to the NPS support groups that were available before day one, which was really pleasing to see. Like I said, Tessa's going to talk about gaps in and the dynamic framework more generally, and I know that a lot of work has happened since February, but we were at the time of inspection we were particularly worried about the potential for gaps in services for women in some regions. Was the case particularly in Wales that we saw. Over the years since TR, we've seen some really innovative work, I guess, for women in CRCs, and at the moment the majority of the female offenders on supervision have been supervised by CRCs, so we want to make sure that that's kept, and it's imperative that the needs of women are met. We saw that regions had been awarded some additional funding in autumn 2020 to commission services, I guess, to nurture potential services and providers going forward for those service users there. And some regions were struggling to identify appropriate interventions because the commissioning people weren't in place to look at the what was available, and the monies had to be spent by the end of March. So that was a kind of a bit of a missed opportunity, and some regions were finding that more challenging than others to support that. Before I move on to Tessa to talk about services, we're going to just pause there to give people a chance to ask questions on what's gone so far, and Lauren is going to facilitate that.
Hi everyone. Yeah, if you've got any questions, if you just want to post them into the chat or raise your hand now, and we'll try and get through as many as possible. We've got about 15 to 20 minutes, and Jim's also here to answer any questions you have.
Lauren, while people are waiting, and given that we've got Jim with us, it might be worth pointing out, because our fieldwork ended at the end of February, there's been lots going on with the programme since then. I don't know, Jim, whether you wanted to say about what the sort of current state of play is. I know we've had the action plan through from you, and you've accepted all of our recommendations, which was good to see. But as of 6 weeks to day one, how are things looking?
Thanks, Justin, and thanks for the opportunity to join you all today. I mean, the first thing I was going to say, Justin, is that I absolutely recognise the kind of position that you and the inspection team have kind of set out in the report. And you're right, things have moved on, but I think the themes that colleagues are kind of pointing to still remain, I think, valid and the right areas to focus on. So I'm certainly not in a space of saying, this is all old hat and, the world today looks different. It has moved on, but I think you're absolutely highlighting the right points. And essentially, other than the effective leadership of the programme team, because that must be somebody else. Just a couple of things that maybe I will just talk about really briefly, just as you say, Justin, to kind of bring people up to current position. So the commissioning under the dynamic framework has moved on. So we've now let 108 out of the 110 contracts that we were intending to have in place for the new structures on the 26th of June. The final 2 will happen in the next few days. We've got providers identified. We just need to go through some preparatory processes to make sure that those direct awards are defensible. That feels like it's a good position to be in. It's obviously now very tight in terms of mobilising that last tranche of contracts, about the last 19 or so that we've let. But we're putting additional resource in to support those organisations. And it's eased by the fact there are very few existing staff who are in scope to transfer to that final tranche of contracts. One of the headlines that we're quite proud about is that slightly more than 2/3 of the total value of those contracts has been secured by voluntary sector organisations. Now, there's obviously a huge range of types of organisations within the voluntary sector, and it would be fair to say that most of those that have won are larger voluntary sector organisations, but we set out with an intent to bring a kind of diversity into that supply chain, and I think we've managed to secure that. The IT migration, which I think we were all quite worried about earlier on in the programme, is going really well. We've now rolled out Ministry of Justice laptops and phones and email addresses and data systems to over 4,000 of that transferring CRC population. And this weekend's quite a big one for us, because we will move the staff who currently work in Kent, Surrey, Sussex CRC onto our systems, and that means as of Monday those staff will be back to using National Delius as the case management system rather than the system developed by the CRC. We've also managed to secure agreement with MTC, who are the organisation that run London and Thames Valley CRC, that they will work with us to move their staff onto Delius ahead of transition, which was one of the big unanswered questions when the fieldwork was completed earlier this year. Kind of two final thoughts. So the people transfer is definitely the beating heart of the programme, if you like. It's the thing that is the most important thing to get right, because whatever successes we have, if we get to a position where staff are not paid accurately at the end of July, which will be the first payroll that we transact, then nobody's going to be happy for very good and understandable reasons. We're working really closely with trade union colleagues. I can see Tanya on the line and maybe others. And I think it's probably worth acknowledging that there are still a group of staff, about 450, who don't have the level of certainty about their role in the future structure that I think we would like at this stage. And that's because their current role doesn't neatly ascribe to a role within the probation service structures or within the way that we operate, for example, finance or HR within the Ministry of Justice. So we know that we need to work really closely with those individuals and provide them with some more certainty quickly. I'll be writing to them personally later today to try to offer some reassurance. But if I'm doing a kind of airing dirty linen in public, I think that would be the thing that I would focus on today as an area where it's not quite in the place that I would hope we would have been at this stage. And then the final bit was just on culture and language. I can see somebody's put a question in the thread that I'm sure Tessa or others will want to come back on. It is something we're taking really seriously. I lived through TR, partly responsible for some delivery of some bits of it, and I think that kind of shadow of that sense of an organisational schism, a two-tier kind of culture in some of the language that was used, I think is really toxic, and we need to address it, but we also need to be realistic about how difficult a thing that is to do. So it's a symbolic measure on one level, but it's symptomatic of how seriously we're taking this, that we are going to kind of change the identity of the future organisation, ditch the national, and from 26th of June we'll talk about the probation service rather than NPS or CRC. I'm sure there are mixed views around that, both in terms of rebranding as an exercise, but also the kind of the choice that we've made. But it's symbolic, but also symptomatic of the effort and investment that we're trying to place into addressing that history and legacy of quite a very difficult set of cultural disconnects between different bits of the system.
Thanks, Jim. Lauren, we've got some questions now in the chat room, haven't we?
Like we've got Jim, we'll go to you first. A question's coming, I'm sure you covered quite a lot of it there already, but is there any timescale for when CRC staff will receive their job alignment letter? With 6 weeks to go, staff are getting increasingly anxious.
Yeah, so there's a couple of layers to this. So as of Tuesday this week, late on Tuesday, we release letters for all staff. So all staff should now be receiving our letter. Some CRCs had previously shared the first set of outcomes with staff. Other CRCs had opted to hold that back until we were in a position that every member of staff could receive a letter. Ultimately, the CRC is the employer. They need to communicate that information to the individual. I can't do that directly. The issue, I just acknowledge again, is that for about 450 out of the 7,500 or thereabout staff transferring to the probation service, that letter doesn't tell you very much at this point. So as an example, if you're a finance professional within a CRC, that letter will likely just say you're assigned to the MPS and you are going to match into the finance function within the Ministry of Justice. That's it. It doesn't give more detail at this stage in terms of specific role and grade, and that's where we're going to have to work with those individuals to provide that clarity. For some, that will be pretty straightforward, and we can do that off the back of an initial one-to-one between the individual and the team. For others, some of that clarity is going to come post-transition. And again, I'd kind of point to that finance example as potentially a scenario where people will come over, they will sit within the wider programme team for a period of time while we work with them to then manage a secondary transfer over into, on that example, the MOJ finance function.
Thank you. And Wendy and Tessa, Laura's asked, can you provide us any reflections on your observations about staff's attitude to the changes?
I think that we saw before Christmas, particularly, although people largely wanted this to happen, I think people were so busy with the day job that they couldn't see what was coming. I think the new year saw a change in that, and it's kind of like, flip, there's only 6 months to go. We're going to start thinking about it more. I think largely it's positive, but that I do think sometimes that people lost sight of the fact that for some CRC colleagues it was a bit more tricky, and people have got settled after a period of a bumpy ride, if you like, since CRCs were starting to settle, so that not everybody felt that, but I think largely there was a positive feeling around with staff.
I think the other bit is just to share, I mean, if there's anybody on the call that we interviewed, Wendy and I throughout our meetings were quite often testing, is this a marriage or a takeover? People got a bit it became a bit of a phrase really, and we were challenging, because I think as Wendy said at the start and pre-Christmas, we were picking up quite a bit from the MPS side that the threat of change felt less for the staff on the national probation side. the community rehabilitation companies' contracts end, they cease to exist, the impact for those staff felt greater. And we were very attuned and picking up on any comments about whether if it's coming from the MPS of, oh, people have got to get up to speed, which is an unhelpful phrase. And but that did dissipate and went as we went through into the new year, into the field work, into other areas, and we could see senior managers picking up and becoming more attuned to that, because of course if you've been in the National Probation Service you might have been managing high risk cases, but you haven't been managing the lower complex, and particularly focusing on the reducing reoffending perspective, which the CRC have been absolutely majoring on in as part of their responsibilities. There's learning in both directions. And when we were talking to senior managers, particularly at the Regional Probation Director, we were particularly questioning the structure of the new and who's been recruited to the senior roles and leadership roles in the new regions, because we were looking for a mix of representation coming from the CRC and MPS, because perception and small words on the end of conversations in the tea room can have a big impact, and they're important. This is a big cultural change. It's going to take time, but people on both sides are going to need to be sensitive as they go forward. But behind it was this sense that actually everyone was saying, do you know, it's the right thing to happen. I think there's a quote in the report from one manager. I remember him saying, he says, I recall TR, you know, it's very messy, it was uncomfortable, unpleasant, but we've got to get through it because this is the right thing to do. And I think that summed up what a lot of people were saying.
Thank you. And Tanya sent a question in saying, with regard to recruitment, has HMI Probation looked at the City Rise app? NAPA has anecdotal evidence that this is hampering internal applicants from progressing, and we have concerns about diversity of applicants as a result.
Wendy. Tanya, I mean, talking to you, I'm not aware that that was raised as an issue during our racial equality thematic, but thank you for raising that, and I'll certainly talk to the team about that. If you've got more information on it, do pass it on to us, because we've as part of our consultation this week, we published proposals for how we will look at diversity on an ongoing basis in all of our local inspections, and every local inspection report from now on will have a separate diversity section bringing together all of the prompt questions from across our inspections. So yeah, do forward on any concerns you've got about that, and I'll flag that with the team.
And Roger sent in a question asking, how will you measure an inclusive culture?
I'm not sure there's a measurements tool that can specifically do that, but I hope with what I shared just now about how we approached our interviewing, we absolutely were testing what we were hearing and pushing back and feeding back to the national team. We had a meeting midway where we sort of said, this is something you really need to think about. So as Wendy said, the change of name is symbolic, but it's important. This is a new organisation that starts off. And Wendy, you've got any thoughts?
Yeah, absolutely. No, and we did see a change, and you know, it isn't going to happen overnight, you know, because it's 6-7 years since TR, so it's going to take time. And like you said, Justin, about how we look at diversity going forward will be really crucial and part of that.
I think the other point to note, Ros, is all of our local inspections involve extensive numbers of interviews with responsible officers, both in focus groups and around individual cases. And I think we can ask these sort of questions in those interviews. I think particularly interested in seeing the attitude of intervention staff and unpaid work staff in the new structures, and real crucial that we avoid any sense of a sort of two-tier service with somehow those staff who've come over seeing themselves as sort of second-class citizens within the new service. So that is an important theme to keep an eye on, I think, going forward.
Thank you. And Jennifer sent in a question saying, I've been reflecting on the tensions between the staffing shortages and the need for stability in caseloads. As discussed, recruitment will take years to provide staffing stability. So are there any solutions being considered? I'm especially asking this considering the use of the exceptional delivery model at different levels over the last year and lessons potentially learned from this.
Jim, is that one for you?
Yeah, happy to have a first go. So I think it's a $64 million question, isn't it? So I think first thing I'd probably want to say is there is no proper fix, is there, other than getting the right number of qualified staff into the service. And I'd always be nervous that we shouldn't water down that message at any point, because the second you do, we'll find the funding taps slow down, and that kind of flow of 1,500 trainees a year will get stilted. So I think kind of start with the headline response, which is there is only one proper fix, and that's getting enough qualified staff into the service, and that's what we're really focused on doing. That said, we are interested in how we keep some elements of blended supervision into the future. So the extent to which we supplement face-to-face contact with use of video, telephone, other means of remote contact. And our mindset on that is really seeing it as supplementary rather than alternatives. But it's definitely, as the questioner kind of suggests, it's a way of slightly load balancing in areas where there is particular tension and challenge. And then we obviously hope that the investment that we're making in digital tools will create some real efficiencies for practitioners. We're trying to not use that word, because efficiencies is immediately translated into save money, reduce number of people. Our mindset is far more around spend less time entering duplicate information into duplicate systems, spend that time with service users. But for example, the kind of new tool that we're going to introduce for referrals into commissioned rehab services providers, as well as the new tool that we built to support staff in court, they're both just far more intuitive and friendly to use. And I think over time will reduce that side of the kind of burden on operational frontline staff.
Great, thank you. And we've got another question here. In terms of moving towards integrated caseloads, is any national guidance coming out in terms of risk escalation? Our team gatekeep risk escalation at the minute, but are unsure what will happen next. Will it shift to an internal allocation task?
Jim.
I'm gonna not answer, if that's okay, Adrian, because I'm not 100% clear on my head in the answer. Could I perhaps via Justin and the team, perhaps I can get an answer to that question and kind of share it with the group? It's the kind of question that's really important to get right, and I wouldn't like to lead you up a bit of a blind alley.
I don't know if this helps, Jim. My understanding
Please do,
is
Tessa.
that there's a further change to NDELI, the case management system, that will happen in the autumn, when the risk escalation process will be switched off. So in that middle phase that I said, post day one, is really when the regional probation directors will be assessing, have they got all the staff sufficiently trained to the blended caseload, so they are allocated caseloads according to their skills and qualifications. And at that point, the risk escalation process, which was a part of TR, will no longer need to be needed. But it's going to be in that period of sorting out that's going to happen, and it may happen at a different pace in each region. I don't know if that helps.
It does. Thank you, Tessa. Would you like a job?
Simi, did you want to add to that?
Thank you, Justin. I have put in the comments that Tessa is absolutely correct. We were on a meeting the other day where they confirmed that the risk escalation process will no longer be required, because it was that interface between cases moving from the CRC through to the MPS, or rejected if not agreed. So the process will be through effective line management, case discussions will take place, and if appropriate, they will reallocate the case to manage the risk.
That's great, thanks, Jimmy. Is there any final questions before we move on with the presentation? No? We'll carry on with the presentation now, just bear with me.
Okay. So we're on to services now, and Jim's already set the scene really for this. We focus particularly on the dynamic framework, which is a new feature of the target operating model, where we've got 11 separate intervention pathways which will to be commissioned for each region. Nationally, the national commissioning team have set about commissioning services for each region on education, training and employment, accommodation, personal wellbeing and women's services. And that in total comes to 110 contracts that are being undertaken at a national basis of commissioning. The plan is then that the regions will be now building up their commissioning capability and will be able to, post the 26th of June, attend to the other intervention pathways as they see fit and where they see gaps in their services. And those other ones, just for people who are unclear on that, is the financial benefit and debt, so finances and advice, dependency and recovery, young adults, cognitive behavioural change, restorative justice, and working with Black, Asian, minority ethnic service users. There's also a national contract to be, as I understand it, to be completed and commissioned for the autumn, which will provide support for service user engagement as well. So no small feat to actually commission 110 contracts in a short period, particularly against the backcloth of the pandemic going on. But this is probably where we had our concerns, and there's some vulnerabilities attached to it. On unpaid work, the plan is lift and shift. So the current services and approach that is in place in the CRCs should transition on the 26th of June, with the plans within the target operating model then to consolidate and start to move to more of a national programme. And there's some ambitions set out in the target operating model to increase the take up and use of employment training and education as a contribution to unpaid work. There's also ideas of national contracts, such as working with the Canal and Rivers Trust or clearing litter on the beaches and things like that. So some initiatives that actually might be able to be rolled out nationally, but they're work in the pipeline. As I said, this was an area where we've made the most recommendations. Oh, sorry, Lauren, I've moved on to the next slide. But we were concerned that the national team were not going to be able to find sufficient services that qualified on the framework to deliver all the services. And certainly while we were doing our field work, it was quite clear there were some gaps appearing. Some of that was due to the commissioning size. So for instance, commissioning accommodation services pan-Wales size didn't necessarily find somebody out there that was ready to do all of that. But if you went to the Police and Crime Commissioner unit size, you might find people that were interested. So they had to go back and rebid at pace. Some of the gaps have been filled by direct awards, which is asking some of the current providers that are on the dynamic framework to extend their provision of services to areas where there was gaps. And that process has been taking place towards the end of our field work and since, which Jim was saying, well, we've actually nailed it. We've got 110 contracts for these services on day one, which is great to hear. Although we are aware that some of those contract agreements have literally been signed in the last week, and the mobilisation of getting those services up and in place for the 26th of June, I still find quite eye-watering, to be honest, and question whether all will be in place. So, for example, I think Wendy mentioned that Wales wasn't sure about its women's services. And as I understand that one of the providers that was in the southwest will be providing to Wales, that provider may well be approaching existing women's services in Wales to provide those services. So they may be in place. On the other hand, they may find there's gaps. Likewise, that still means all the HR issues of actually TUPEing people across from different organisations or working out subcontract agreements with those providers, how they're going to work. Do we know whether they've got access to sufficient places to interview and work with the service users and so forth? It's not a small piece of work, and there's a shortage of time. So we do have some concerns about how much will all be stood up on day one. We can certainly see the will is there and the mechanism is in place to get there, but there's some vulnerabilities as to what actually is happening on day one, and that remains to be seen, and we certainly will be testing it in our future inspections. It's good to hear Jim talk about 75% of the contracts have gone to the VCS. We were concerned about the impact on some of the small local providers that some of the CRCs had, and that could have been right down to a small 1-2 man organisation that was providing bespoke counselling in one county. That sort of arrangement was going to struggle to compete on the dynamic framework as it's being committed, and as services are being commissioned. They may be able to find their way in through subcontracting to the people that have won the larger bids. There's also scope potentially on the Regional Outcome Innovation Fund for the regional managers to pick up and attend to some gaps as well, and I'll come to that in a second. Behind all of that, of course, is that the regional strategic leadership team were having to create and develop a commissioning capability, and that is only just coming into post, and it relates to Wendy and the staffing, that actually there was quite significant commissioning skills sitting within the CRCs and those roles, and how they align in a new national organisation with MOJ are complicated, and people's job titles change, so there's complexity there. We did have concerns about the regional strategic leadership for resettlement services. In the TOM, we thought it lacked clarity, and we were particularly concerned that there wasn't in the proposed structure for each region at a strategic level somebody that got oversight of resettlement services. I think the responsibilities were going to lie for coordination with the leader at the probation delivery unit, so that could be county level or a number of boroughs or so forth, and the local prison. But obviously you need a vision of how you're going to coordinate services on resettlement across the whole region, and there needs to be some consistency there. And we all know that the prison probation estate does not magically align evenly across the country. And you'll find that there's prisoners, say, sitting in Wales that actually mostly come from the northwest of England, and there's a lot of coordination work that needs to be attended to there. So if I move on to the next slide, this is our recommendations in respect of services, and hopefully these reflect some of the issues that I've touched on. So ensuring commissioning services in the regions are informed by an up-to-date strategic needs analysis of the full probation caseload, including all transferring from CRC cases. This relates to the fact that you've got a range of different case management systems coming together on the 26th of June. Regional probation directors could not with confidence say they'd got sight of their whole future caseload and could cut it to say how many women, how many people have got drug alcohol needs, how many have got accommodation needs, what the risk of harm is. They won't get that data until post the 26th of June, and the caseload is all into one place. So we do think that needs to be reviewed quite urgently once they're the other side of transition. And likewise, the commissioning of the services that have already commenced has also been based on the best data available, but that was not a consolidated caseload that could be analysed by need nationally. It's been pulling in information that the National Probation Service had, but obviously they didn't have a large part of the caseload, particularly in medium and low risk of harm. We've got some parent organisations have not been using NDLIS, so their caseloads have not been visible. So we do think that probation directors need to give themselves some time to systematically review the contracts that are being commissioned to make sure they reflect and meet the needs of the service users in their region. But it does depend on that piece of work following the 26th of June. I've touched on resettlement services. And we do think there is a really important role to be undertaken at a strategic level of somebody coordinating, working with the prison governors, working with accommodation providers, drug and alcohol meet at the gate providers. A lot of the commission services will also be supporting resettlement, and that is not going to be able to be achieved all at a local probation delivery unit level. So we're pleased to we have picked up that there has been some support and some funding that's gone in, and that recommendations being progressed. Jim might want to come back and say a bit more about that, but that was a concern because resettlement is it's about 40% of the probation caseload. People coming out of prison, they're vulnerable. It's a critical time. Probation inspectorates put a lot of scrutiny out over this issue, particularly since TR with through the gate services. We've seen a lot of improvements. We don't want to see those lost. And then we've also said that ensure appropriate services are in place to manage risk of harm and address risk of reoffending during the last months of the CRC contracts before they terminate. I don't underestimate the pressure the senior leaders are in this and the managers in the CRCs are on at the moment, but it's really important, particularly against the backcloth of the pandemic, that we don't take our eye off the ball, that there's a day job going on, and we want to make sure that people are supervised safely and effectively throughout this change programme. Wendy.
Thank you, Tessa. I'll just finish off by talking about information facilities, and I think it's fair to say that at the start of this, when we looked at what we thought we might find, I think this is an area we thought would not be as positive as what we actually found. Thinking of the probation buildings and the estates, there's been a really comprehensive audit of all the properties and a plan in place as to which buildings will remain in the unified model. About a third of buildings were transferred over to HMPPS in January, and that enabled the kind of IT work and the infrastructure work to take place. For day one, most staff will remain in the same buildings they're currently working in, and then transition activity will take place thereafter, although there are a handful of buildings that already have gone joint location. Capital investment in outdated MPS buildings was particularly welcomed. In our national inspection previously, we commented on some of the state and the disrepair of some of the buildings, so it's good to see that there is some investment coming. MPS and CRC staff currently work from 450 different buildings, and during TR, I guess CRCs have been able to move many of their staff into modern open plan accommodation, and these sites were often better than the legacy buildings occupied by the MPS, which, like I say, we found that have been poorly maintained and increasingly unfit for purpose, some of the MPS older buildings. So a major task of the transition programme has been to agree a consolidated plan which maps out which buildings will remain in use from end of June, and agree which CRC buildings are transferring over and which will go back to their original landlords. There's about 97 CRC buildings that are being transferred by the end of June, and I think the majority has already gone over. There's a clear plan in place for the remainder to transfer. And the last bit on there, the facilities management contract, again, it's something we have reported on both in our divisional and national inspections previously. That is an area of concern, and how long it takes for things to happen. And I guess that remains a cause for concern. It'll be something we'll be looking at in our future inspections. In terms of digital, again, we heard earlier about the number of staff that are transferring. So those staff all need a new kit to work with, and all of the technology in place to do the day job. There were some particular issues for those CRC staff in 3 regions who were not using OASIS and DES. And obviously that's the risk assessment tool that's going to be used in the new model. I know from something I heard this week actually that this position has changed over time. I know at the beginning of the year there was some suggestion that a lot of those staff may need to be trained post day one. in Oasis and Delius. When we finished inspecting, we understood that a large tranche of staff would be trained prior to day one. But if I'm right, and I'm sure Jim will correct me later if I'm wrong, actually the majority, if not all staff, will now have had that training prior to day one, which is really welcome, because that was a particular rubbing point of delivering this part of the agenda. The HMPPS digital teams have worked with MPS regions and CRCs to ensure everyone's got the right kit. We saw at the end of our field work in February, they were just starting the first pilot, and that went really well. And from what we've heard since, that the roll out of new equipment and data migration has gone well. And like I said, it's no small task, and it's really crucial. So it's ambitious. The plan's ambitious. I guess for me, if I was thinking about delivering it, it's kind of, there's some, like Jim said earlier, this weekend's a big chunk of transition work going on, and that needs to happen in order for day one to be successful for everybody in those areas. The recommendation we had about this, we talked about the workload measurement tool. We recommended that a new workload measurement tool was put in place, and again we're pleased to see that launch this month. The current workload management tool is obviously outdated, and CRCs have been using different tools as well, and we know that there's an ongoing project now starting based on the activity-based costings, with a review to a full refreshed workload management tool being available. I think that's towards the end of this year, which is obviously really welcome, because the costings and the times are very historic now, and the world's moved on. And that will also be linked to the tiering model that's in place, and that's in, I've got in my notes is in development, but I understand from something I've seen very recently as well that that's been launched as well, to assess the weighting of cases, and goes back to the what we were talking earlier about the risk escalation, the blended caseloads, and how crucial that will be as staff deal with a variety of risk and need cases. So that kind of finishes off the snapshot really of the report. So I'll pass back to Lauren to take some more questions.
Hi everyone, as before we've got about 20 minutes for questions. If you want to post them in the chat or raise your hand, feel free to jump in. We're happy to answer as many as we possibly can. I don't know if it'd be useful, Jim, for you to cover what you've just heard again from your perspective.
Yeah, really happy to, Lauren, if that's okay. So I'll try to just pick up on a couple of points to clarify the current position. So starting at the end, yeah, it's absolutely right, Wendy. We've gone, sorry, it's jargon, isn't it? We've gone live. We have launched our new tiering model, which takes more account of need alongside risk than previous model did. So that's now out there. It's the means by which the MPS is allocating tiers to cases. It will be matched to the CRC caseload at the point of transfer. So that feels like a good step. We totally agree with the Inspectorate's views on workload measurement tool and the need for that to be updated. It needed updated anyway. Now's the right opportunity to do it, to take into account the full breadth of work that this unified probation service will be doing. We hope that we'll be able to kind of provide some form of workload measurement tool for different elements of probation practice as well, not just sentence management. Different question about, is that all in one tool or some separate products to kind of pick up on different elements of work? But we definitely want to kind of build on where we are. I think September is our current plan around when we would hope that new workload measurement tool is in practice, but you're probably more sensible in terms of talking about the end of the year, Wendy, but certainly this year. Maybe just two other things, because always better to get into the debate. So just on resettlement, so I absolutely agree that there is a risk that having just fixed TTG by putting more money in, that we're yet again changing it. There are two things we're doing to try to minimise that risk. So the first is we've taken the Inspectorate's recommendation around ensuring there is a strategic lead in each region for resettlement. and have asked RPDs to identify one of their senior team to take on that role. RPDs have got different views on who that should be. For some, they want a head of ops. For others, they think it sits best with head of community integration. I'm not sure it matters. What's important is there are a group of individuals who see their responsibility as kind of protecting and speaking up on behalf of resettlement. It isn't a dedicated role in all regions, is our starting position, although a few are going to put in place a specific role to cover this, and also some of the additional investment in accommodation support that we have in a few vanguard regions. But we'll keep that under review, and if it needs to be carved out as a separate role, we will look at that again. And then perhaps just to pick up on the question or comment from Jennifer in the thread, if that's okay. So the risk of getting a bit defensive, Jennifer, I'm not sure I totally agree that this feels like TR over again. I think we've, first of all, gone out and directly contracted with organisations rather than just create very complex supply chains, everything flowing through private sector providers. We are really proud of that headline around the diversity of the provision that we've got. And of course, beneath those 110 organisations, there are smaller independent specialist providers who are part of that consortia or supply chain. But your point is valid. It definitely is valid. And I think, ideally, we would have arrangements in place directly with even more organisations. And we did have to simplify the format of the dynamic framework in order to make it doable in the context of COVID. So, for example, originally accommodation we were going to contract at police force level, and we pulled that up to region. So your point is valid, and apologies if I did indulge in a bit of defensiveness. In terms of the Regional Outcome and Innovation Fund, so it is designed for exactly this reason. So far more discretion for RPDs about how they use that, obviously still within kind of managing public money rules. And it will ultimately be 20 million a year across the regions. This year, I think it is 5. It grows to something like 12 next year. But again, we'll keep that ramp up profile under review. And if we can put more money into it quicker, we will.
Thank you. And whilst I've got you, Jim, there's a question coming from Martin. He says, hi, I work in prisons and Catch-22 staff say they still don't know what will happen to them. Is this an issue with communication filtering down to staff, or are working conditions, locations, etc. still to be finalised? Thank you.
So, Martin, I could interpret that question in 2 ways. One is, do Catch-22 know what's happening to them? And definitively, they should. So Catch-22 has been successful in some parts of the country in winning contracts to be our future accommodation provider or provider of personal wellbeing services. So it could be that Catch-22 as a supplier are still on your patch locally, maybe doing something slightly different, but with some familiarity, or not. But Catch-22 as an organisation will definitively know that. I think it's more likely you're probably asking about the individuals involved. So this goes back to the point from before. It is possible, depending upon where they are in the country, that those staff have only just or haven't quite yet received those letters. One of our CRC parent orgs wasn't prepared to send letters until we had the full batch. And as I said earlier, that was only on Tuesday of this week. So it could be a kind of lag issue as a result of that. But all staff should be in a position now, and if not very early next week, to have had a letter.
Thank you. And we've got a question from Daniela. She says, in terms of estate planning, will the newly unified probation service encourage home working alongside office face-to-face contact with supervised individuals? And would HM Inspectorate of Probation support this approach? Then she adds, from previously working for my local CRC as a senior probation officer and prior to the pandemic, staff welcomed the blended approach, and I found that allows staff to work from home for admin time, increase motivation, which in turn increase staff productivity. So we'll go to Jim first, if that's okay.
So yes is the short answer. So I think, like every organisation, we're still working through exactly what a kind of post-COVID approach to delivery looks like, but we're very keen to keep the things that have worked. Our headspace at the moment, but we'll want to keep this under review, is that we think a mixed model is going to be right for most staff, and whether that's 2 days in the office or 3 days in the office and the rest working from home, but that kind of feels about right. there'll be individual circumstances where that isn't right, and some people won't be comfortable working from home, and we of course need to support those individuals. But that kind of blended model, I think, is where we would hope to end up. It does raise really interesting questions about, well, what does that then mean in terms of the kit and provision we should be making available to all staff? Because like many of you, I spent the first 6 months of lockdown pretending it was all going to go away and not really investing in a decent desk or chair, and as a result probably spent more at the osteopath than I would if I just bought a desk in the first place. But I think we kind of fudged that a little bit, if I'm honest, and I think if we are going to say long term that answer, then I think we need to have a very clear offer for staff in terms of home working.
Shall I just say, Lauren, from an HMIP point of view, this is a question that we explored in our thematic last year on recovery from COVID, and we asked both staff and service users about their experiences of remote working and doing it from home. Although a majority of both staff and service users welcomed the chance to work from home or to have appointments from home, I think there was a significant minority of both who didn't like that, who wanted to be back in a face-to-face contact. Some of the more vulnerable service users, I think, have missed having that direct contact with a probation officer, who might be one of the few contacts they have actually. And some probation officers told that without that face-to-face contact with more vulnerable people they were supervising, they sometimes didn't know whether perhaps people were going off the rails a bit or needed more support. I think what we lack is an evidence base about how effective remote supervision is with people on probation. There hasn't been research done on that. We've called for urgent and robust evaluation of whether remote supervision is effective and in what circumstances. So a blended approach may well be the best way forward. I think the issue is, what is the best blend? How do you blend at different points in a sentence? I think we're sceptical about that 100% approach to telephone supervision could ever be the right way forward, but certainly there is potential in a blended approach. But let's make sure we evaluate what works going forward.
Thanks, Justin. And is there any more questions that anybody would like to ask? We've still got a bit of time. A couple of people have asked if the recording will be available, and it will be on our website on Monday.
Lauren, if I can just add a little bit to Jim's comment on the Regional Outcome Innovation Fund, because I think we thought that looks one of the really interesting areas of the new target operating model, that the regional directors will have an opportunity to nurture new services that are actually bespoke to their caseload and to their communities. It does depend on them developing their commissioning capability. The only question mark we did have was that how that money is to be deployed cannot be spent on any services that are enforceable, which is slightly different from the commissioned rehabilitative services. And so I think that is one area to watch, because it's great, and I think the regional leaders will really welcome the opportunity to be able to sit down at strategic meetings with their strategic partners, police and crime commissioners, with money in their pocket. Our experience, probation's been very good at this in the past, in the probation trust days, of actually going in with £10 and coming out with £100 from a meeting with strategic partners. Probation can kick above its weight, so going in, that is really welcome. But I do just question the criteria that's been put to that, as to whether that will limit the scope as to how it can be deployed. Jim, I don't know if Jim's got anything to add to that.
I think it's a fair challenge, Tessa, and we'd actually welcome a bit of a follow-up conversation on that, because we've got some flex around those rules, the rules we've set. There's a logic for it, in the sense of we are trying to kind of keep a distinction between the different pillars of the future model. Yeah. But I accept your challenge that it's potentially slightly too hard a line to draw.
Could put their hand behind their back a little bit, which would be a shame.
Yeah.
Thank you. And we've got a question from Ashleen saying, back to services, have any improvements been made in terms of commissioning services specifically for ethnic minority service users?
I'm happy to have a first go, if that's okay. So we consciously chose earlier on in the process not to have a standalone set of services on day one for Black, Asian, minority, ethnic service users. It was a active discussion we had within the programme, and we opted instead to embed that requirement within accommodation, ETE, and personal wellbeing. Those specs and contracts then do have kind of relevant requirements. So the provision is within those main commissioned rehab services contracts rather than standalone. And welcome views on that, because there were very strongly held divergent opinions within the kind of national team and senior team in probation about the right approach. I'm aware of one existing CRC contract with a specialist provider, I think in Yorkshire, where we're working with the RPD to try to sustain that service post transfer through a direct award. But beyond that, it will all be delivered via that kind of embedded requirement within those mainstream services.
I mean, it is worth saying, actually, and you'll know this, that our recent thematic on racial equality showed that the provision of services have got worse since TR, with the loss of some specialist services over the last 4 or 5 years. And I think the fact, Jim, that there's only one service still going that's going to transition to new arrangements is sort of indicative of that. There will be an important role for regional directors in assessing the potential for using their local funds to support specialist services, and I think the scale at which they commission is very important too. Sometimes these specialist services can be very local. They can be parts of an individual city or area, so not something that can be met necessarily through regional or national commissioning arrangements. But we've said we'll go back and look at this issue within the next 2 years, and looking forward to see hopefully that range of services does improve in the coming 2 years.
Thank you. We've got a question here. Is R&N convertible to offender assessment systems, both in terms of assessment method and readable for those who never used it? If not, how will it be solved?
So, Timcay, does this relate to one of the systems in use within either London or KSS? Sorry, I don't know if people can. I'll answer on that basis, and apologies if I'm misreading it. So we aren't going to be able to kind of replicate all the information that's in those existing systems into Oasis, because they just don't talk to each other in that way. What we will make available to staff is kind of copies of existing risk assessments, and then as we go again on any case, we'll need to create a new record within Oasis. So it is a bit clunkier.
Just added. If this is London, Timescale, R&N.
Yeah.
Okay. Any more questions from anybody? Feel free to raise your hand and jump in.
So so one go explain that point, because I'm listening to this, so I'm not sure I was that clear. So the difference in case management and risk assessment systems is all of the systems that CRC's built on sentence management, case management, talk to Delius. That isn't the case for any of their risk and needs systems. They don't talk to Oasis, so it's kind of shared off system in the way that Jennifer describes.
Thank you. I think that's it for questions by the looks of things, Justin.
Thanks very much, Lauren. Thanks to all of you for joining us today. I hope you found that useful. Thanks particularly to Tessa and Wendy for their presentations. Good to have you with us, Jim, as well, to answer questions relating to your programme. Great. Many thanks to Lauren for supporting us with logistics for this, and to Kevin, who's sat in the background as well. I think the key message for me is, and broadly, having done this thematic, we felt that the transition was on track, and I think our confidence in delivery increased during the course of the field work, and it's been helpful to hear from Jim what else has been done since February. But I think, Tessa, as you were saying with your house analogy, this is very much the beginning, not the end. The true transformation of the service will happen over the next 3 or 4 years, not on the 26th of June, and that's the period that we have to deal with these long-standing issues that we've been identifying in our inspections around high caseloads and issues around meeting people's needs and dealing properly with risk. And that requires not just structural change, but investment in the service as well. It's good that there is this 150 million extra going in this year, but that is a 1-year commitment at the moment. We strongly argue you need sustained investment in the next spending review to support all of the aspirations that I know you, Jim, and Amy Reese and others have for the service if they're to be delivered. So, you know, we look forward to seeing what happens over the next few years and to inspecting the new unified service. We have had to adapt our inspection methodology to deal with that, and we're consulting on that at the moment, particular focus on those local delivery units and how they get on over the next few years. There is a feedback questionnaire, Lauren, that I think we're going to send out, so do let us have your feedback on this event. We are planning to do these events for all of our thematic reports going forward, so I hope people do find them useful. I think, Lauren, again, a recording of this event will be made available
on Monday
on our website, and do look at the report itself, which is already up on our website to read all of Wendy and Tessa's findings. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining. Do enjoy the rest of your day and your weekend, and see you at the next event.